Gil put up the Birchas Torah. Birchas Torah. All right. Okay, here we go. Baruch atah Adonai melech haolam asher shechanu mitzvotanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Okay. Guten morning. Good Aufstand. Good morning. Good morning. Okay. So Barshat Chayei Sarah is kind of like the four weddings and a funeral. Every year we say it's like four weddings and a funeral. Basically, three chapters from the book of Genesis, 23, 24, and 25, that begin with the funeral, as it were, the funeral part of it. It's Sarah's death, and then Avram basically bargains for a burial plot in a place called Hebron, or Marat Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah. And chapter 23 is essentially just, like being in the Arab Shuk somewhere. It's like, in Jerusalem, Machane Yehuda, it's like very much conversation between Avraham and this guy Ephron Achiti and some others, and kind of fascinating dialogue where they're talking past each other in a very classic, no one is really asking for anything else between me and you. I mean, of course, sure, take it. And then by the end of it, it's like, there's money exchanged and the plot is bought. And it's just a fascinating chapter in many ways. And then chapter 23 gives way to the longest chapter in the book of Genesis itself, not the longest chapter in Torah, but the longest one in the book of Genesis, which is chapter 24 and the story of Isaac's betrothal, of Eliezer, or domestic Eliezer, or the servant of Abraham going back to the land that Abraham comes from in order to find a wife for his son Isaac. And of course, it's the star is born in Rebecca. She's a star from the beginning, and has all the as they say in Yiddish, all the milas. She has all of the qualities that you would want for the next generation. And also fascinating, we're not going to be looking at chapter 24 today, but it's an incredibly beautiful and interesting chapter. And then the final chapter, chapter 25, will actually be the chapter in which Avram will remarry a woman named Keturah and so on. It'll be kind of the other marriage portion of Chayei Sarah. So it's a short parsha, but it's has some beautiful elements to it. A beautiful parsha. More broadly speaking, as I said last night in my sermon, it's really the parsha in which the things that had been promised to Avram Avinu, to Avram the patriarch, back in chapter 12, are kind of fully materialized. Because of course Avram can't move forward, and the project of which Avram is the chosen one can't move forward without the assurance of Isaac's continuity. Like Isaac has to find a wife or have a family. And that can't happen until until first Sarah leaves the scene, which is interesting. Sarah has to leave the scene, and then Isaac can have a wife, and Avram also can move forward with Keturah, and that's essentially it's a pivot parsha, a parsha that is basically between Avram and the rest of the book of Genesis. Chayei Sarah acts as that kind of fulcrum. The next week's parsha, Toldot, will be like moving forward with Isaac and his family, Rebecca and the two children that they'll have, and so on. So we're not going to look at any of that. We're going to just look at the first two verses in the parsha. That's it. We're not going to make it past the first two verses because they're juicy and they're worth exploration and our interrogation and our Torah. So the first two parsha, or the two first psukim, or the first two verses, are on the screen. Okay? So, everybody online can see this, I hope, yeah? You guys can see it? All right, gesundheit, that's great. Let's, okay, make it a little bit bigger. All right. Source number 1. Vayu Chayei Sarah. And these were the life, or the lives, the span of Sarah, literally means, and these are the Chayei, the life, the lives. It's almost it's the lives of Sarah. Mea Shana, 100 years, ve'esrim shana, and 20 years. You guys have text, you need? In 20 years, ve'sheva shanim, and 7 years, shnei chaye sarah. These are the years of the life of Sarah. Yeah? So the English doesn't fully capture it. I mean, the English wouldn't want you to get stuck in any of this, so it's kind of like Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life, came to 107 and 27 years. Okay. But somehow, even though this formula, which is, first of all, let's just notice the structure of the sentence, okay, of Vayu Chaye Sarah. And these were the lives of Sarah, and it ends with the same phrase, Chaye Sarah, the lives of Sarah. Right? So it's almost like an internal chiastic structure within the, almost like A, B, A. Yes. Very simple. Right? It begins with Chaye Sarah, and then it ends with Chaye Sarah. So that if you're looking up on the screen, you can see where the cursor is. Here, this phrase, right? This phrase here repeats itself. It begins the verse and then ends the verse, right? It's not captured in the English. There's kind of like the verse itself feels like a completed verse, like it begins and it ends with the same phrase, almost like a Euroboric, if you could say such a thing, almost like a verse that eats its own tail. Like the verse itself has something complete about it, right? It begins with something and ends with a very similar thing, right? And we'll come back to that a little bit later on, where the sense of tamimut, of something that's complete, has we've come full circle. Like the verse begins somewhere and then comes back to its own beginning. Yeah? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then in the middle of the verse, or the meat of the verse, is something that's also interesting, because if you didn't know that this was the regular way for a descriptor of someone who dies to have their years described, you would think that something's happening here that's really strange. Because instead of just saying she lived 127 years, it says she lived 100 years, 20 years, and then 7 years. So that grand total is now divided into 3 units, right? 100 years, 20, and 7. So at prima facie, if you're just looking at that, right, and you didn't know the rest of the Torah, which of course we do, you would say, oh, that's unique. Right? Wow, that's kind of drawing my attention. Why is it like that? Right? 120 and 120. Just say she lived 7 and 20. 127 shanim. Like, why say it in that way, where you say 100 years, 20 years, 7 years? Right? Now, so I'm just gonna let the cat out of the bag just at the beginning. Like we're about to see what Rashi does with this. Right? We're going to go to the 11th century. But just so you know that in the 12th and part of the 13th century, the Ramban and others, Nachmani's other commentators said, like, oh, that's exactly the way it is with Abraham and with Ishmael. Like, it's not an unusual biblical way of describing someone's years. Like, that's a common way to do it. It's not like it shouldn't jump out at you in quite the same way it does. But look, it does jump out at Rashi. If you look at source number 2, it says, so Rashi will quote Genesis Rabbah. Midrash Rabbah. Midrash Rabbah is in somewhere between the 5th and 8th centuries, kind of a compilation of general rabbinic explorations or expansions on the text. Let's look at the second source. L'chach nichtav shana b'chol klal u'klal. Rashi says, can you see where we are here? Mm-hmm. Right? The reason the word shana, which means here is right year, it is written at every term. Lamar lecha, to teach you, shechol echad nidrash le'atzmo, to teach you that each term must be explained by itself as a complete number. Bat kuf kibat chaf. She was 100 in some way connected to, like the 100 is connected to the 20. Because at the age of 100, she was as innocent in terms of sin as she had been at the age of 20, which is the age according to rabbinic law, right? Let's just not get into this. The rabbinic law that like she was not responsible until she was 20 years old. Let's just avoid that entirely. But ma bat chaf lo chat'ah. right? She'ena bat onshin av bat kuf below chet. Like she was as innocent at 100 as she was when she was 20. And then bat chav kebat zayin liyofi. She was as beautiful at 20 as she was when she was 7, or we might say as innocent or as wholesome in her. Like beauty here can be understood in a number of different ways. Let's avoid the different understandings of years and like. But what's remarkable here for a moment is that Rashi seems to be like quoting Genesis Rabbah. Seems to be saying that Sarah had 3 different lives. Right? There were elements of her that began, like 7 years old, and like there was a 7-year-old inside of the 127-year-old. There was a 20-year-old inside of the 127-year-old, and at 100 also she had included all of those things. Right? She had all of those elements, and that each one of them was a kind of way of describing a woman who had a remarkably broad, like a full life in every imaginable way. Right? Many different elements were there. What is the point? What is you think the point of this midrash? About like whether or not literarily it's true that like 120. Like what do you think the rabbis are trying to do with Sarah here in this moment? What are they trying to? Yeah, Tony.
So the psychoanalysts say that we are everyone we've been, and in this case, she's been many, many beautiful women. Yeah.
So what does that say? In other words, yeah, right. Well, but what are the Rashi?
We have a child within. We have a young woman within.
Okay.
We have
so you're going to read
of beautiful.
Like psychodynamically, you're reading like they're giving depth to somebody who, in some ways, right? You're like filling out her life,
Yeah, like Freud put it. We have an id, a superego, and an ego, and transactional analysis says we have a child within. A parent within.
It's not every Shabbat morning that Eric Byrne shows up in the shul. I just want to say thank you so much. It's good.
Very welcome.
No, I thank you for bringing him here. So Tony's shot is okay. Rashi is basically not Rashi. Genesis Rabbah, which Rashi is living afterwards, like quoting an earlier source, saying like, right, we contain multitudes. She has many pieces to her. Sarah Imenu was a complex person. And
Exhibit B.
Right, there you go. Games people play, great. So that's one shot. What else do you think is happening here? Yeah.
Well, I think they're trying to resurrect her as a person of more depth and more importance, because for me, Sarah doesn't really make a good showing before her death because of Hagar, and because she in a way seems like a device, and she's very different from Abraham in terms of the actions she takes. She doesn't take a lot of actions, but the ones she does don't seem very creditable to me. So it's sort of trying to resurrect her as, she's the mother of our people, so let her be beautiful, glorious, and without sin.
Right. Okay. So from a modern perspective, I love that. Let's just be. So what they're trying to do and what you're trying to do might be two separate things. So what you're hearing in this is that, since for you and many of us looking at the text, she's not her actions seem to be kind of not that credible, or she doesn't act as much as she maybe should, or act in ways as she should. This is a way of resurrecting that, or right. So I think that's certainly plausible, and I think that's a legitimate way to look at this text. I think Rashi, I guess it begs, the broader question is, would Rashi recognize his own commentary? Would Rashi think that what he's doing is trying to, in some way, prop up, Sarah, who needs to be propped up? I think that is probably not the case, right? But I would argue that nonetheless, there's certainly a need. For some reason, there's a need to prop up Sarah here and her elevated status, right? And maybe that's just because it's just a teaching to remind people lest they forget, because the text doesn't call her a tzadekes or a tzaddik or a righteous person. It doesn't use the phrase vayikva, which is usually used where the Talmud says that when a righteous person dies in the biblical text, certain words are being used, and maybe here, right, they're not being used, and so maybe Rashi I should say Genesis Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah wants in some way to teach the people who are in the shul on the Shabbatot, how amazing Sarah is. Look at these 120 and 7. She was pure and she was good, right? There's certainly that element might be available here, and certainly to go out of their way to make the case that she is as pure at the age of 100 as she was, which was 20, is to invite this sense of like, lest you think maybe that she, right, yeah. So I think there is something there actually that is maybe not as strongly as you said it, but I think that there's something there. Yeah, I'm also, by the way, people online, if you're thinking like, not to chat, you can chat. I mean, I know that I'm usually not happy with chats, but I'll try my best today to be reading chats. If you're writing in things at this moment, feel free to chat in, but also feel free to raise your hands also, so I can see who has a hand raised. So I'm gonna, I think Nikki and then Rhoda.
What does sin mean?
Say it again?
What does sin mean in this context?
Read it whatever you want. She didn't throw away garbage into the recycling bin in the right recycling bin. She sometimes drove above the speed limit in New York City. It was 20 miles an hour. She was sometimes at 22. It doesn't mean sexual immorality.
What's the corresponding word in Hebrew?
The word chait, which means broadly construed a sin, meaning whatever sin might mean in the moral valence of, for the rabbis. In other words, she was sin-free, which means she was guilt-free. She had no wrongdoing in her hand. She wasn't.
Not even Hagar.
Not even Hagar. Right? Not even Hagar. And I think that's the point.
Not nice. Not nice.
Yeah, not nice. Right, yeah, we don't like this kind of hagiographic. It's very hagiographical, right? It's like, oh, what about the Hagar situation? Now, Rhoda, yeah.
Well, I just wondered, is it possible it's not so much about Sarah, but since she's the mother of us all, I find it very fulfilling that it's for all of us, forever. All of her descendants, all her women.
Are what? All of our descendants are what?
That we have beauty in us, and that
we
have
also,
a child in us, and that we're innocent.
Yeah, I think that there's something. Let's get back to that in terms of like the transgenerational aspect of this text and how it might relate to us. Later generations will definitely make use of that framing to kind of bring it home and say like, oh, what does that have to do with us?
Yeah.
I do want to.
Because a lot depends on the sentence. Could you read it again in English, but with the Hebrew syntax, like a non-elegant English?
Right.
I want to understand the way the sentence returns to itself.
Mm-hmm. So Vayu Chaye Sarah. And these were the lives of Sarah, or the lifetime or the lifespan of Sarah, full stop. 100 years, 20 years, and then 7 years, the lives of Sarah.
Okay.
Or the years of the life of Sarah. Shenei Chaye Sarah.
Thank you.
Which can, right. Now, that last phrase would seem to be an addition, like in the first verse, the years of Sarah's life. And that, if we look back here, if we look at the first verse, look here, it says, Shenei Chaye Sarah, right? That capping element is absolutely unnecessary, right? That is absolutely unnecessary. That's where it kind of returns on itself. But it's redundant, and its redundancy, yet again, invites midrash, right? Because it's like, oh, why is that there? So here's what Rashi, you look where the cursor is. You see here in source 2, kind of 2a here, this little piece. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Yeah.
The word years is repeated and without a number to indicate that they were all equally good. Mm-hmm. In other words, lest you think that there were, 127 means that they were qualitatively different. They each had a valence to them, but all of them, and the word in Hebrew is really important. You'll see how it comes back. Kulan shavin letova. All of them were equal in goodness. Kulan shavin, the word shaveh means equal. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, just for a moment, just for a little bit of flavor, if you look at source number 3 here, 2 other commentators, one from the 13th century in France and one which was from the 12th and 13th century, which is a kind of compilation. They each have a bit of a different take. Source number 4 here, the source 3 was overview of these 2 sources. And I just want to give you another flavor on the beginning of the verse before we come back to the end of the verse. On the, right, these different years. And some of these you might not like this one, but it's important to see it, I guess. And just, I wanted to quote someone else who quoted it, writing about when a person's life begins. Right? These two sources seem to argue that the repetition of the word Chayei Sarah is to teach us that she had two different lives, a life before she gave birth to Isaac and the life after she gave birth to Isaac. So Chizkuni writes, Harotzim limnot gematriot, those who like to kind of count gematria, which is numerology, right, assigning symbolic meaning to words using their numerical value, say that the value of Vayihiyu, and these were, right, the very first word in the verse, Vayihiyu, and these were, comes out to 37. Right, Vav is 6, Yud is 10, that's 16, Hey is 5, is 21, another Yud is, right, 31, and then you have Vav, which is 6, it's 37. And those 37 years from the day that Isaac was born until the Akedah, when Sarah dies, right? אבל 90 שנה שחייתה קודם לכן אינן חשובים חיים, שמי שאין לו בנים חשוב כמס. So, but the 90 years, not 90 days here, before that are not called a life because a person who has no children is as one who is dead. Now, obviously, by the way, this source, I came to this source through an Orthodox rabbinical student, a woman who's at Maharat, an Orthodox rabbinical student, and she herself had struggles with fertility, and certainly there are people who choose not to have children and so on. So it's a deeply troubling text to imagine that her life was only meaningful after she gave birth to Isaac. Although maybe she would have said that, right? Maybe Sarah herself might have said that from the biblical text. But again, it's not our worldview. It's certainly not mine. But there is in the Chizkuni this desire to kind of paint Sarah in a kind of with a brush of, the center of her life was becoming a matriarch, becoming a mother, and so the text seems to be indicating that she lived two lives, and the word shnei, which means the years, can also mean two. Shnei Chayei Sarah, that she had two different lives, the life before Isaac and the life after Isaac. The Da'at Zekenim seems to say something somewhat different. If you look at source 5, 1 second, Bati, I promise.
Thank you.
Ger, Da'at Zekenim writes, וגר שנתגייר כקטן שנולד דני, בכל השנים שהיו קודם לכן, כל הרע שעשה לא נחשב לכלום, והיה כמי שעשה תשובה כל ימיו. So Da'at Zekenim says something different. That apparently, according to the Da'at Zekenim, that a person, this is actually a little bit shocking too, that maybe the two different lives of Sarah are the life before she did tshuva, right? And the life after she did tshuva. This would make you happy, Nikki. Meaning, Sarah lived two lives, which is very different than what Rashi said. The life right before she realized the errors in her ways, and the life after she realized the errors in her ways. Like the one, in other words, she was reborn. And when you convert, and conversion here doesn't mean it literally means a convert, but it could also mean somebody who repents, like, Amazing Grace, right? I saw the light. The minute you do tshuva, it's as if you're a wholly new person. The tshuva meaning repentance, or like beginning anew. It's like you're a new person. So her understanding, his understanding, it was like that if you do tshuva, this also relates, by the way, to Yishmael. In many sources, that Yishmael, according to many sources, not really clear. It's very obvious that the rabbis wanted to make Yishmael into a bad guy for obvious reasons in the text and in other places. So they said that he did tshuva because otherwise, how would he have reconciled again with Avraham and with Isaac? But in any event, there's this idea in our literature that once you do tshuva, you become a whole new person. So your life begins anew, and you start counting your birthday, as it were, from that moment.
Yes.
Three different ways of understanding Sarah's right? The repetition of the words, these are the years of Sarah's life, right? One is to tell us that all of them were equally good. That's slightly hagiographic. And, she was a good person from the age of 7.
Hagiographic.
Meaning like a kind of framing of the life of a person in righteous terminology, like making them out to be a saint. Right? So
It literally means the life of a saint, a hagiography.
right, the life of a saint. So this is a kind of the construction of the image of Sarah that the rabbis want to construct is one who was pure in every manner and form. One idea. The repetition of the word in the second framing from Chizkuni is to teach us that, that Sarah had 2 lives, the life before she gave birth to her beloved Isaac and the life after, because her whole life was geared towards Isaac. And so this is just an indication of what she valued the most, which is more what they valued the most, but in their rendering of this. The repetition is there to divide up her life, actually. And then this third one, which is a little bit more in the direction of maybe not the opposite of hagiography. It would be an anti-hagiographic text. Okay, opening it up for a couple more comments, then we're going to move on to the very next verse. We'll start with we're going to start in the Zoom now because people have had their hands up, and then we'll come back to you, Bhakti, I promise. Don't worry, I won't forget about you. Jay?
Shabbat Shalom. If we're going to divide Sarah's life into 2, this might be a bit simple-minded, but couldn't we also start with Sarai versus Sarah?
Yeah, good question. Why not? Like the artist formerly known as Sarai. The matriarch formerly known as Sarai is Sarah. Why not? Why not include Sarai? Like let it be that. Yeah, that would be a much more natural nominal break. I would think that would be like, let's divide along the lines of identity in terms of name, right? Great. Good that Richard has Merriam the Webster's dictionary. Okay, was there more there? Okay, Jay, or that was go on to Daniel, and then Richard. Yeah.
Shabbat Shalom. Getting back to this, 2 questions actually. First is a more general one. Maybe I should say the first one you answer if you want or not. When you mention the chiastic structure, usually the center of the chiasm has some meaning, and you sort of didn't say anything about that. So if you plan to talk about that later or touch that, but the main point I'd like to make is a more general one, which is something that does bother me in general about these commentaries. And you touched upon that perhaps in your reference to Daniel Hartman's comments about Akedat Yitzhak and Abraham. Is this usually the attempt is to justify or to make the characters in the Bible in general good, or even actions that we think are reproachable, unacceptable, and so on, must have some explanation in the end that makes them good, and so on. And I don't see why can't we also say, well, these people had bad traits, and those are bad traits to avoid, kind of thing, not just hagiographic in the sense that you were referring to, which seems to me this attempt. I can't see really, looking back at what's said about Sarah in all of the chapters, what's so remarkable about her? She put up with Abraham. She stood up defending Isaac, I guess, against her perceived menace from Ishmael. She threw Hagar out. So what? What's so remarkable about her?
Okay. So yeah, first of all, she's good looking.
That's right.
She's very beautiful. Second of all,
That doesn't mean anything.
right.
Means something.
It's a joke. It's a joke.
Sorry, lady. It means
Okay. So listen. Okay. All right. In the room, the room's gone crazy, Daniel. You spurred something. It's like there's a big release here. So I just want to 2 things. One is that I thought that we had talked about the center of the chiastic structure because the chiasm begins with a general category of these are the lives or the years of her life, and then enumerates them and differentiates them. And we talked about the meaning of that differentiation, which we'll actually we'll come back to that later. We'll come back to the meaning of that differentiation, those 120.
So what's the actual center for you?
Well, the center for me is the 100, the 20, and the 7. That's
okay.
Right.
I thought there was a 20.
No, I don't think that the center holds in that way. I think that that's one unit, and it's a much simpler chiastic structure. It's not a complicated chiastic structure. So, but we'll come back to that, I promise. And I want to say to the last point you made, which of course, I think a lot of us are feeling the same way. And I think that why did the rabbis feel the need to create to take a very complex character in the Bible and smooth them out and make them really perfect? Is itself an interesting question. Like for many of us as moderns, the beauty of the text is that it doesn't elide over the warts of his characters, and that actually makes them deeply relatable characters and makes them very and in some way the rabbis needed to clean them up, and that project actually of cleaning up these characters might have worked at some point. It clearly they had motivation for it, right? But I think for us, it's certainly the text actually seems to give us much more three-dimensional and characters, and that actually is much more attractive. So I just want to say yes to that. Richard, and then we'll come into the room. Sorry, Marilyn, you're in the next round, but Richard, and then we're going to come into the room with folks here. Richard.
Thanks, David. Shabbat shalom. I think there are three things going on here, three segments in Sarah's life, and none of them are happy. Infertility until she finally gives birth to Isaac. Then the trouble with Hagar and Ishmael is 2, and then she's dissed when Abraham takes off Isaac to the Akedah with apparently not informing Sarah at all. And the next thing we know, she's dead. So it's in that view a very unhappy and dissonant life in 3 stages.
We're going to come back to that in the second to last, in the penultimate text of the day. We're going to come back to exactly that perspective on Sarah's life, which upends this kind of Rashi's perspective and brings us a little bit closer to what we've read in the text thus far, without kind of Rashi's gloss. Tarte mashma, both meanings, meaning double entendre. He glosses over it and he glosses it and makes it nice and shiny.
Sorry, I didn't mean to preempt you.
No, I love that you preempted me. In yeshiva, by the way, whenever you preempt a text that will come later, you always say Baruch shekivanti. I'm blessed that was my intention. So I love it. It's great. Batya, yes.
Thank you. So at a time when women had very little worth, I think Rashi, and you also in preparing this, if I may say, really elevated her to a point where women should have a great deal of worth, and slowly we've come around to that.
Yeah, I was going to say that even though we can all agree and we all should agree and we should always say this out front, that women's voices and women's presence in the text is denuded and it's muted and we could say the misogyny is not something that we need to discuss debates. It's undebatable. Yeah. But we've always though honored and venerated women in certain ways, and that also can be like talked about in the ways that we venerated them and the attributes that we lifted up and so on. But we called them Sarah was always together with Abraham. But you're right, this is you'll see the Midrash in a moment is going to give a lot of depth in the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer in a moment to who Sarah. Yeah, star on Rosh Hashanah is the star.
Right, and speaking of Rosh Hashanah, the wailing of the shofar
is
said to be
Baruch Shekivan. I tell you, Bati and Richard are going to teach next year's Chayei. Okay, great. Let's go. Yeah,
it's just a very quick grammar question, and you alluded to it when you were translating, but it says 100-year singular. 20-year singular, yes. And then 7 years plural.
That's the biblical way of saying it.
Okay, that was the question.
It works in both directions. It's not odd at all.
Okay.
We have to go on. I'm going to take one more comment, and then we're going to move forward. Yes.
Did you say, because I didn't understand, did you say that Sarah made teshuvah at any point? Is that your belief? That she made teshuvah?
I don't know that. My belief personally.
All right, and as a expert on other.
I'm not an expert.
as
I
an
don't know what
expert
happened there.
on
I don't even know.
literature. No,
I don't know. I'm just
I know
reading.
you weren't taking notes at the scene, but as an expert on this biblical commentary system, does anybody say that Sarah made
Is
teshuvah?
that how she treated? How she?
Yeah, I think this text seems to be pointing in that direction. I don't think it's not a broader understanding of Sarah's life. I think Sarah, in the rabbi's view, could do no wrong, although it's not entirely true. Ramban and others' commentaries said that she did do things that were wrong. The Ramban was very critical of Sarah, what she did to Hagar.
But did any of these luminaries say that she made teshuvah or hint?
I'd have to do, besides this text, I'd have to do more research on that, but that's a great question.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Okay, let's move to the next verse. I said we're going to focus on two verses. So the next verse in the story is the death of Sarah, right? We talked about the life of Sarah in verse 1, and now verse 2, source 6, which you can see on the page, source 6. This here, right? Vatamat Sarah, and Sarah dies. Kiryat Arba, in Kiryat Arba, in the Kiryat is like in the town, or it's called Kiryat Arba, it's the name of it, which is also known as Hebron. He Hebron, the Eretz Canaan, in the land of Canaan. Vayavo Avraham, and Avraham came, lispod the Sarah v'liv kota, to eulogize Sarah and to cry for her. Where was Sarah? Where was Avram? Where was Avram? It says Avram came in order to eulogize Sarah and to wail. Why does that say vayavo? The word vayavo, to come, means like he arrived from somewhere. And Abraham arrived at the airport. Where was Abraham? So look at Rashi, source number 7. You see source 7? Yeah, and you see source 7? You there? What does Rashi say? Lisbod b'sara v'liv kota v'nismecha mitat Sarah. Sarah's narrative, the narrative of the death of Sarah, follows immediately. It's juxtaposed la'akedat Yitzchak, to the binding of Isaac. Lefi al yedei b'sara akedah shemizdamein b'na l'shchita v'kim'at shelo nishchat. Through the Bisorah means like the announcement or the tidings, like through that message that was given to her of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, that her son was given over. He had been made ready to be slaughtered. Shchita here means slaughter, ritual sacrifice. And kimat shelo nishchat, and he was almost, almost slaughtered, almost been sacrificed. Parcha nishmata mimena v'meita. Her soul left her body and she died. This is one of the most remarkable midrashim, right? And I'm sure people are familiar with it. Look, if you want to see the original source, it's from the 8th century, in a source written in Muslim lands, frankly, and in it there's some really beautiful things that connect the Jews and Muslims. In the general Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, and certainly around this piece, there's some beautiful things in it about Ishmael and Isaac. But look at the broader midrash, source number 8. You see it? This is where Rashi is drawing from. You can see that Rashi is later than this source 7 is actually later than source 8. 8 is earlier, and Rashi is drawing from that midrash. And so Rashi says, the midrash says, Uchsheba Avraham mehar Moriah chara apo shel Samael. When Abraham returned from Mount Moriah in peace, the anger of Samael here was like Satan, like the devil, was kindled. Shera'a shelo alta biyado ta'avat libo levatel karvano shel Avram, because he realized that his desire of his heart to frustrate the offering of our father Abraham had not been realized. And so what did he do? Halach ve'amar, he went and he amar l'Sarah. Hey, Sarah. Literally, it says, hey, Sarah. Lo shemat ma shenasa ba'olam. She said, didn't you hear what's going on in the news? Amro lav. She said, no, I'm not on social media. I don't have any idea what's going on. Amar la, he said to her, Lakach ishech azaken lenar Yitzchak v'ikrivo la'olah. Your husband, the elder one, your old husband, really, your old man, took your young boy, your lad, Yitzchak, and he served him up as a korban, served him up as an offering. V'anar bocheh, and the child was crying, umiyalel shelo yachol linatzel, and the child was crying and saying, I can't be saved. Miyad hitchila bocha umiyalelet, and immediately Sarah began to cry, obviously in sympathy, in mirroring of her own child, crying the way he was crying. Bachta shalosh bichiyot keneged shalosh tikiyot, and she cried 3 cries that were parallel to the 3 sounds of the shofar. And then she cried shalosh yelalot keneged shalosh yivavot, and then 3 broken wails, like the wailing of the shivarim. Uparcha nishmata v'meita, and her soul left her body and she died. Ba Avraham Avinu umatza shemeita, and Abraham came back and found her dead. Shene'emar vayavo Avraham lispod l'sara v'livkota, and as the verse says, and Abraham came. Where did he come from? He came from, literally and figuratively, he came from Har HaMoriah, Mount Moriah. This remarkable text, right? This remarkable text connects in a very profound way the death of Sarah to this trauma, this post-traumatic stress disorder, this post-traumatic stress response. We could spend hours on this midrash itself, and there are a number of different variations on the midrash. And there are important differences between them, and I think the great Aviva Zornberg has written so beautifully and powerfully about it in many different places. But what's remarkable here in this moment for us, of course, is the profound, that's true, Asher Chaim. He is a young lad, even at the age of 37, right? That Avram went from to Beersheba, right? This does contradict that. And that's what's, I think, so remarkable about this text, is that even though the simple meaning of the text is that Abraham is coming from Beersheba, right? Which the text seems to have gone there, right? Maybe he went there to visit, whatever. But in order to to give greater depth to Sarah's sacrifice, or what actually killed Sarah, it actually paints a picture of not this kind of that she died in this fullness of her years. She died with your children surrounding her. She was this holy matriarch that lived at 127 was fully innocent. It's a much more tragic picture that is being depicted here, a much more complicated picture, a picture of a disjointed relationship with her husband, like a life that was, that ends in misery in a way, like a miserable ending to what the Midrash is trying earlier to depict as a beautiful life, right? A full life, a life that is complete in all of its ways, like that circle of the first sentence, the first pasuk. Like her life was complete, but she died in this midrashic valence with an incomplete life, with a life that I waited 90 years to have a child, and then my husband sacrificed him, right? And by the way, in the Rashi's quoting of this text, did you notice Rashi says that she died in hearing that he was almost killed?
Sure.
And in the text that Rashi is drawing from, it doesn't say that Samael said he was almost killed. It says he was killed. Right? So it's interesting that Rashi clearly had another text, and there is another text.
In
But
Genesis, is there any mention of who the messenger is who tells Sarah this?
so the news here is the Midrash imagines it's Satan.
Right.
And in the other Midrashic valence, in a different Midrashic valence, it's actually Satan doesn't just come and say, hey, Sarah. He dresses up, he dresses up to appear like Abraham. Or his face contorts to be Abraham. So here's the question, and this is why I want to move into some of the things people already said, because we have about 15 or maybe 20 minutes. Let me just pull the first sentence, the first verse and the second verse, and this particular rendering, and the next piece together into what Richard and others had said, and then we'll open it up. So if you look at source number 9, I spoke about this last night, and every year I speak about this, that the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, the rabbis say that Abraham had 10 tests, and he was able to withstand all of them. In order to make known how great the love of Abraham was, because 10 trials, God only tests those whom he loves, and there are 10 trials. And there is, according to one great commentator, as I quoted last night, that there is the burial of Sarah in the beginning of this week's Parsha is one of those 10 tests. Like Avram didn't find a burial place, and that's the test. But really, maybe we should say that differently. Maybe it was that the tests of Sarah were more profound in many ways. And maybe we should say that, that Sarah's life, in all of its elements, were really. How did Sarah manage to remain Sarah, given everything that she had to go through? So let's look at source number 10, which is a Hasidic source. And then we'll look at a final Hasidic source, and then I'll open it up. And I wanted to build these two verses into these last Hasidic sources. This Hasidic source in source 12 quotes the Midrash, that quotes a proverb, Yodei Adonai Yemei Timimim, that God knows the days of the Timimim, the righteous, the complete ones, the wholesome ones, the innocent ones. Rashi Peresh, and Rashi commented, Shnei Chaye Sarah Kulan Shavin L'Tova, that the last phrase in the first verse, it says, these are the years of Sarah's life. That redundancy came to equate the 100 and the 20 and the 7 into one, like they were all shaveh, they were all equal in goodness. But this Hasidic commentator doesn't say they were all equal in goodness, meaning she was perfect. It means that the word shaveh, which means equal, is also the word equanimity, hishtavut. Humidat hishtavut, equal is the same as the quality of equanimity, hishtavut. The extremely spiritually evolved capacity where a person remains tamim, remains whole, regardless of whatever happens to them. We're in source 12, Nikki. About 6 lines into the English.
Wow.
Rich and poor alike each have trials and tribulations. Yesh nisayon la'ani v'yesh la'ashir. V'sara b'tchilat yamea avru alea kama zmanim kashim. He says that Sarah's life had many hardships. Famine, being taken to Pharaoh and to Avimelech and pawned, right? She went through so much. U'v'sof yimehem haya lehem kol tov. This is another version of Sarah's, almost another version of the hagiography. But at least in this one, the hagiography is not like Sarah lived a perfect life. But Sarah had a very difficult life. Sarah went through horrible, horrible trials and tribulations. And using this term, by the way, by this Hasidic author who says the word nisayon, a test, feels to me like he's acknowledging that just as there were 10 tests for Abraham, there were 10 tests for Sarah. And one of her tests, of course, was could she remain, even with all the trauma that she endured and all the difficulties that she endured, could she find a place of hishtavut, like a place of being able to remain equanimous or with some version of belief in life? Maybe the Midrash says that she ultimately lost that battle. Maybe the Midrash says that, the final news with all of its portent and all of its pain was just too much for her, and she completely, she couldn't. It was too much. But that, and in that sense, maybe, I wouldn't want to say that she failed the test, but maybe you'll see in a moment that actually she didn't fail the test. There's one Hasidic writer, a very important one, who says that her dying was itself a successful test. But like in this depiction, she's not perfect, her life isn't perfect, but she maintains a certain quality of spiritual perspective that allows her to navigate these difficult moments, the ups and the downs. Right? Maybe it's not clean the way that we would like, she's not doing tshuva in this one, but she is still like a beacon in some ways. And then this last text that this is the most important text of the day for me, and I come back to it almost every year, but certainly this year too. This is a text taken from the Warsaw Ghetto. This is Klonimus Kalman Shapira, the Piazetzner Rebbe from the Warsaw Ghetto, whose nigun we lifted up last night. And everything that we said in the last 45 minutes is building towards this brilliant exegesis, this brilliant commentator, and the way that he weaves together everything that we have said and finds a way of reconciling it for his people who are living in the Warsaw Ghetto, week by week, month by month. This is from the earlier part of the war, 1939, where they were already suffering immensely. The Jews were already suffering immensely, and schools had been closed, and obviously the ghettos, what they were seeing was horrific. It's all in Hebrew, so I'm going to say it because I didn't have a chance to translate it this morning, but I will translate it as we go, okay? Very, very slow. So if you want to just close your eyes and listen, this is his commentary. He quotes Rashi, that the reason why year is repeated over and over again is to teach us how she was 100 and then 20 and then 7, right? And that all of them, right? And then the redundancy. And these are the years of Sarah, that end of the verse, which brings us back to a full circle to teach us that all her years are shaveh, equal in their goodness. And he asked a question, he said, how could it be? We look at every other righteous person in the Torah, they're not lifted up the way Sarah is. And also, by the way, if you look at the way that Avram's life is described at the end of his life, he also has this shana thing. So it's really, really, why does Rashi have to go out of his way to say that there's a moral lesson here? Isn't it just the way that the Torah describes the death of a person as it repeats the word shana? So he says, let me teach you something, he says, from the great and holy Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Rimanov. Or Menachem Mendel of Rimanov said that the Talmud says that there is a covenant of salt and a covenant of suffering. Just as salt sweetens the meat, so too a little bit of suffering can sweeten the life. And the Rimanov Rebbe said on that Talmudic teaching, let's take the analogy one step further. Just as too much salt can ruin the meat, too much suffering can ruin a life. You could stop right there, okay? That would be enough, right? Just as too much suffering can ruin the meat, too much salt can ruin the meat, too much suffering can ruin a life. He says, suffering has to be measured in a way that we can receive it, but if we have too much suffering, it has to be mixed together, right? Yumim muzagim birachamim. So it has to be sweetened with compassion. If you have suffering that's overwhelming, it can be too much. And this is, he said, how we should understand why Rashi connects the death of Sarah to the Akedah of Yitzchak. That she died, right? She died because she heard something that was too much for her soul to hear, and it overwhelmed her. And he said the faithful shepherd, Moses, put the death of Sarah next to the Akedah. In order to become a melitz, meaning like something that would storm heaven, that would interrogate heaven. Every time we read it, every year, this juxtaposition would interrogate heaven and act as like a defender for us Jews here in the world. To say that through suffering that is too much, even somebody as holy as Sarah, who was as pure at the age of 127 as she had ever been in life, she was so holy. At the age of 100, she was as if she were 20, and as if she were 7. She was so holy, right? Why does the Torah go out of its way to extol Sarah? It's only to say that if a person like that, who was equanimous, and who had spent her whole life in meditation, and had spent all of her life doing peace work, and had done therapy and workshops, and was like as evolved as any human being could be, and still with all of her kelim, all of her inner attributes and all of her strengths and faculties, even someone like that could not handle to hear the news of her son dying. How much more so, says the Rebbe in the Warsaw Ghetto, the rest of us here, in Warsaw. How much more so us with each and every day hearing more and more of the atrocities and more of what's happening. It's too much for us. It breaks us, right?
Yes.
It's like it's too much. And so he says, that's the meanings. You know, it says, it's as if the lives, the years of Sarah, her years were sinning, as it were, against her other years. She should have lived more years. But she took to her heart, like this is even more remarkable. And if he didn't write it, nobody should say it. It's as if she gave up her life at that moment on purpose. You can hear Christological overtones. It's as if in that moment, like as a bodhisattva, or like, you know, like Lahavdil El Havdalot, like, you know, like Obi-Wan Kenobi at that moment, right? She says, I don't want the rest of my life, because if I were to live longer, if I were to live any longer, I would lose the opportunity to die in this moment and to make a statement to God and to eternity that sometimes the life after is not worth it. And I'm saying to God, you can't do this to us, because people will give up their will to live. Even someone like I'm giving up my life.
Yes.
And so the text had to come back and finish the verse Shnei Chayei Sarah and say even the rest of her years, the ones that she should have lived, were all l'tovah. They were also for good. Even the ones that she gave up. Don't think that she gave them up and she sinned by giving up those years. Those years were also part of the 127 years that were l'tovah, because she did it for the sake of the Jewish people, or we might say for the sake of all sentient beings. It's to say that there is sometimes suffering that's overwhelming and it's too much. And in that way, and he was saying, of course, and this is why this is one of the most radical Torahs from the Piazetz Rebbe. You know, sometimes there's too much suffering. How do you live afterwards? How are the children? How are the children? I was talking about this. How are the children in Israel? And anybody who knows what happened on those couple of days, a couple of hours, how can they go forward? How can the children in Gaza, who are living through horrific trauma now, how can they go forward the rest of their lives? How is it even possible? And so here's Sari Menu, and in the language of the Be'ezes Rebbe saying, it's too much. It's too much. You can't call that a life. So enough, God, enough. And Moses puts it there, the way he says it. The faithful shepherd put this story right there at the end of chapter, right next to chapter 22, as if to prosecute as a way, to call God on the carpet and say, no, enough's enough. Enough of this, and too much. It's too much. Too much salt. You're going to ruin the meat.
But the rest of the world is getting involved with it.
So on 1 second, Bhakti Sri, I love you, but I have to also honor all the voices here, and there are people whose hands have been up, and so I'm going to call on Marilyn.
Behind you.
And there are people behind me. Okay, first we'll call on Marilyn, who's had her hand up for a while. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Oh, I'm not Marilyn, I'm Elizabeth.
No, Marilyn.
Yeah. I thought you were just...
Okay. Yes, that was an amazing midrash. I would just like to add one more midrash that a midrash that I apply to Sarah. In my mind, what kills her when she hears that Isaac is being sacrificed is that she did everything to protect her son. She even sent the stranger Hagar and her son out into the desert to die to protect her son. And at that moment, she realizes that the protection didn't work. Her plan didn't work. And that agony of realizing that she sacrificed other lives and that it didn't even work to save her son is what kills her.
Wow.
powerful. It was fake news, Barbara. That's true. It was fake news.
Behind.
Yeah. First, no, Elizabeth, and then people behind me. Elizabeth, and then.
Can I say something?
First Elizabeth, and then. Okay, good.
I'll be fast. This is a confession. When I first read this morning, I reread it, I immediately thought of Macbeth. Shana, 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 Shana. And the despair and lack of hope. Because it reminded me of Macbeth's speech when he hears his wife has died. And he says, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, life's petty pace from day to day. And I think it's right there in the first, you don't have to see it as total despair. You can have a more, cheerful interpretation, but that's how I read it.
Yeah. Yeah, did you want to say something?
Okay. What I get out of this is something that Satan or the devil he dressed himself up like Abraham, and he told a big lie. And she died because of this lie that affected her so strongly. It was total gossip. And gossip is very dangerous. It can actually kill.
Another perspective. Looks like Tony, someone who hasn't spoken yet. Thomas.
Briefly on the Christological aspects in Testament. Mary is the figure most beloved in Catholicism, the mother of Jesus. And I never thought until today that her life story was an attempt to redeem the life story of Sarah, because she allegedly is the only human being to be born free of the so-called original sin of Adam and Eve. And she's the only person in history, along with Elijah, I guess, to go to heaven without dying. So she's kind of born without sin, and she moves on without dying. And then this announcement of the death or near death of Isaac is the annunciation by the angel Gabriel that you will have this son, and he will die, but he will also live forever. And this paradox that the years after the death are also the important years, the years of living forever. And that this pivot of in birth is the death, and the idea of annunciation. And so mothers upon mothers upon mothers upon mothers. When Buddha was trying to describe the Bodhisattva, he described the love of the mother for the child at the moment of birth. It's in one of the sutras. And that to sustain that love throughout all the life is like the moment of annunciation and crucifixion, just from that perspective.
So just 2 verses from the Parsha, and a lot of Torah that has been written on them, and I think that it's a very powerful moment to think about suffering and about how much suffering is happening right now for us and for this community and more broadly in the world, and how much pain has been produced in this moment. Just to think about, just to hold that. It's a very difficult thing to hold at this moment. In any event, we're holding a lot, all of us, and but it pales in comparison in many ways to what's happening on the ground for people in reality in Israel and in Gaza, and I feel very strongly about, and I have a very strong opinion at this moment about what needs to happen and what is continuing to happen. And I also feel very deeply, right, that we're going to be living for many years with the intense pain and trauma that is here with us, and we, especially the Jewish people, on the week of Kristallnacht, and the horrors that Israel experienced on October 7th won't take any time. They'll never be healed, ever. I was with Elie Wiesel's son, Elisha Wiesel, this past week, and And his son said that he went back to Siget with his father, for his father to go back for the first time to where he had been born and to see the house that he had been born into. And at some point, someone said something about the Holocaust and then said something about Israel, and his father stopped him and said, I never ever want to connect those two things because there is no solace for what took place. I refuse to be comforted, he said. I refuse to be consoled. I refuse. He said, I keep it as a mystery. It's a mystery that I will never understand. And I think that as more and more of the actual facts on the ground become more clear, what took place on October 7th, video and everything, I don't think that there will be, I don't think Israel will ever be the same, and I think that the horrors of that day will never be comfort for it. And so I want to just, I just want to say also that today is Veterans Day, and so I just want to lift up all of those who've died in service of this country in all of its different ways, and that we all pray for a day that there won't be a need for war, there won't be a need for aggression or violence, and that God should bless us to be able to build a world of peace for our children and our grandchildren soon. And say Amen.
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 Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Yes, your call.